My name is Matthew Gaines, 45 years old, former surgeon, current nobody. 8 years ago, my hands, which were supposed to heal, failed to save an 8-year-old boy. 3 years ago, I was kicked out of St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Ainsworth, where I worked for 15 years. And today, I'm standing on Greenwood Hill watching the burial of my wife Laurel, whom I was not allowed to visit. Our daughter Amber thinks I don't deserve the right to say goodbye to the woman I pushed away. And maybe she's right. It's drizzling a light rain just like the day Noah died. I lifted the collar of my shabby coat, which had once been decent, and smoothed my overgrown beard. This hill overlooked the entire cemetery. The procession moved slowly, as if it was hard for people to carry not only the coffin but also their own grief. I squinted, trying to make out faces. Amber was right behind the coffin, straight as a string. Even from here, I could see how tense her shoulders were. Walking beside her was her boyfriend, whose name I didn't know. That's the price of alienation. I no longer knew who was around my daughter. There's Howard Merrick, our family lawyer, in a strict black suit. And here are a few of Laurel's colleagues from the elementary school where she taught. The kids loved her. Everyone loved Laurel. I clenched my fists in my pockets. Memories came flooding back without warning, as they often have in recent years. That day had started out as usual, a routine surgery I'd had hundreds of times. Noah Pearson was smiling when I walked into the room before surgery. He had blonde hair and a scattering of freckles on his nose. "Dr. Gaines, will I be able to play baseball as soon as this weekend?" he asked. I grinned and promised that he could be back on the field in a month. I was so sure. Things went wrong when we were almost done. Sudden drop in blood pressure, arrhythmia, cardiac arrest. We fought for his life for 2 hours. I refused to give up when others realized there was no saving him. "Time of death is 15 hours and 22 minutes, I finally pronounced, pulling off my gloves. It later turned out that Noah had a rare complication. The commission found no fault on my part, but that didn't change anything. I'd seen his parents' eyes when I broke the news to them. I saw their world fall apart, and something in me crumbled too. The rain intensified, and I cringed as a cold drop slid down my collar. Down below, people were opening umbrellas, black domes like crows flocking to a funeral. I knew I shouldn't be here. Amber had made that clear yesterday when I'd called her. "Don't you dare come," her voice shook with contained rage. "You lost that right when you abandoned us, when you abandoned Mom. I hadn't abandoned Laurel, at least not physically. But after Noah died, I stopped being the man she married. Every night, I dreamt about that boy. Sometimes in those dreams I was able to save him, but I would wake up and reality would return, even more brutal from the contrast. I started drinking, first a little, then more. The alcohol dulled my senses, allowed me to forget about that boy on the operating table for a few hours. Laurel was trying to help. God, how she tried. "Matt, you need to talk to someone, professionally," she was saying, putting her hand on my shoulder. I could see the pity in her eyes. Our last major fight happened 3 years ago. I came home drunk after a shift at the hospital. "I can't take it anymore, Matt," Laurel said then. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You won't let me help you. You won't let anyone help you." "I don't need help," I snapped back. "I need you to stop looking at me like I'm some broken appliance you're trying to fix. I look at you like a woman who loves her husband and sees him destroying himself." "You don't love me." I said this as confidently as if it were the absolute truth. "You pity me. Those are different things." Her face changed then. Something extinguished in her eyes. "Go away, Matthew. Just go." So I left. Took a few things and got a room in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Ainsworth. A week later, I got called into the chief of medicine's office. One of the parents of a young patient complained that the surgeon smelled of alcohol, and I couldn't blame them. I wouldn't trust my child to a doctor like that either. After I was fired, I hit rock bottom. Money ran out quickly, and I ended up buying an old travel trailer on wheels that I set up on a piece of abandoned land by the river. I survived on odd part-time jobs, sometimes as a loader at the supermarket, sometimes helping fix cars at a machine shop. My hands, which had once performed complex operations, now hauled crates of oranges and changed the oil in engines. Laurel called. She came by a few times. I don't know how she found me, but I didn't answer the door. I didn't answer the phone. Eventually, she stopped trying. Down by the grave, the pastor was saying something. His words were carried away by the wind, but I knew the standard funeral eulogy. And ashes to ashes. I saw Amber flinch as the first handful of earth fell on the coffin lid. I should have been there for her. Should have been there to support her shoulder, to tell her everything was going to be okay, even though we'd both know it was a lie. I started down the hill. I don't know what pushed me. Maybe a simple desire to be closer to Laurel one last time. I didn't intend to go near the grave. I just wanted to stand back up. But Amber spotted me before I could stop myself. Her gaze burned through me across the pole ghost. She said something to the guy next to her and took a quick step toward me. People turned to look at her, then noticed me. I saw their faces change. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was quiet but full of rage. "I came to say goodbye to your mother." "To my mother?" Her eyes narrowed. "To the woman you abandoned when she needed you most? You don't deserve to be here. Leave." I looked at my daughter and saw how much she had changed in those 3 years. The last time I'd seen her, she was an undergrad student with Laurel's soft features. Now there in front of me was a grown woman with a hard stare and a crease between her eyebrows just like mine. "Amber, please." "No, Daddy. You have no right to call me by my name. You have no right to be here. Do you know what Mom's been going through the last year?" Her words hit me under the breath. The last year? What happened in the last year? Amber noticed my confusion and grinned bitterly. "Of course you don't know. How could you possibly know? You're too busy feeling sorry for yourself to notice that Mom was dying." Dying? Laurel had been dying for a year? What are you talking about? My voice sounded hoarse, like I'd been screaming for a long time. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed 14 months ago. Doctors gave her 6 months, but she lived almost a year. She was stronger than everyone thought, stronger than you." I staggered back as if from a blow. Pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive cancers, virtually untreatable in its advanced stages. As a doctor, I knew that all too well. Why? Why didn't she tell me? Amber laughed, but there wasn't an ounce of mirth in her laugh. Why would she? So you could play out another tragedy? She didn't want that. She wanted to live out the rest of her time with dignity. Howard Merrick approached us. He had a look of concern on his face. "Amber, is everything okay?" "No, it's not okay. He's here. We asked him not to come." Howard turned to me, and I saw a mixture of pity and disappointment in his eyes. "Matthew, this might not be the best time." "The best time for what? To say goodbye to the woman I've loved for 20 years? Loved?" Amber practically spit the word out. "You were too busy with your grief to notice her pain." Every word was like a knife. Because Amber was right. If I'd been around, if I'd been paying attention, I could have seen the symptoms sooner. And even if it hadn't saved Laurel, I could have been there for her until the end. Support her. Make sure she didn't suffer. "Mom didn't want you to know," Amber continued a little quieter. "She said it would break you completely, that you'd punished yourself enough already. She protected you until the very end, even though you didn't deserve it." I looked at Amber and saw how exhausted she was. Dark circles under her eyes, pale skin. She'd spent the last year caring for her dying mother, while Dr. Gaines. Howard's voice sounded softer than Amber's, but firm. "There will be a reading of Laurel's will tomorrow at 10 o'clock in my office. She wanted you to attend." Amber turned sharply toward the lawyer. What? Why would she want that? He doesn't have… Howard held up a hand, stopping her. That was your mother's wish, Amber. She was very clear about that. My daughter shook her head as if she couldn't believe her ears. Then she looked at me again. Okay, you come over, but now get out of here. Let us say goodbye to her without all of this. She circled her hand as if to point out the mess my life had become. I nodded. It was only fair. I'd lost the right to be a part of their lives a long time ago. See you tomorrow, Dr. Gaines, Howard said, and he and Amber walked back to the grave. I remained standing, staring after them. Amber held herself upright, just like Laurel did when she didn't want to show me how much pain she was in. The rain intensified, turning from a drizzle to a torrential downpour. I didn't bother looking for shelter. Cold drops mixed with hot tears on my face as I walked down the deserted streets of Ainsworth to my trailer. The trailer greeted me with emptiness and cold. I pulled off my wet clothes and collapsed onto the couch without wiping myself down. My gaze fell on the framed photo, the only one I'd kept. Laurel and I on our wedding day. She's laughing with her head tilted back, and I'm looking at her with such adoration that even now, 22 years later, I'm embarrassed by the strength of that feeling. I reach for the bottle of whiskey on the table, a familiar gesture of the last few years, but stopped myself. Laurel wouldn't want me to face the news of her death like this, about her illness, about the fact that she'd included me in her will anyway. Will. What could she leave me? We didn't have any property together after the divorce. The house went to her, but I assumed it would go to Amber. Maybe some memorabilia? A photo album? I closed my eyes and Laurel's face flashed before me. Not haggard, as it must have been at the end, but bright, alive, with sparkling eyes. The way I'd seen her in our best days. That was how I wanted to remember her. I'm sorry, I whispered into the void. I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. That I didn't notice. Thunder rumbled outside the window and the rain drummed on the roof of the trailer, drowning out my words. Howard Merrick's office was in an old 2-story red brick building in downtown Ainsworth. It had once been a hotel, but they'd converted it to offices in the early 2000s. I was 5 minutes late. No wonder. I'd spent the rest of last night in agonizing insomnia, replaying Amber's words about Laurel's illness in my head. By morning, I felt shattered, and even a cold shower didn't help clear my thoughts. The receptionist, an older woman with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, gave me an appraising look. I knew what I looked like. A wrinkled old suit that hung over a slim body, stubble that I'd tried to tidy up but without much success. Eyes reddened from sleep deprivation and tears. "Dr. Gaines," she said with doubt in her voice, "they're already waiting for you." They are. So Amber was already here. I nodded and headed for the door at the end of the hallway. Howard Merrick stood up from his desk. "Matthew," he held out his hand. "Thanks for coming." His handshake was firm and confident. Mine was weak and moist with nervousness. Amber was sitting in a chair by the window. She didn't even turn around when I walked in. Her back was perfectly straight as a stick, her hair gathered into a tight bundle. Her strict black suit made her look like a young businesswoman, not my little daughter who once demanded I check the closet before bedtime for monsters. "Have a seat, please." Howard pointed to the chair across from his desk. I shook my head and lowered myself awkwardly into the chair, trying not to look at Amber. She still didn't dignify me with a glance. Howard coughed and opened the folder in front of him. "We are gathered here to read the last will and testament of Laurel Ann Gaines," he said in a formal tone. The document was duly executed and attested on the 5th day of February, 2025. February 5th, 4 months ago. Already aware of her illness, she decided to change her will. "Before I read the main provisions," Howard continued, "Laurel left a letter that she asked me to read aloud in the presence of both of you." He pulled an envelope from the folder and opened it carefully. I noticed Amber tense up even more, if that was even possible. "My dear Matthew and Amber," Howard began to read, "if you are listening to this, it means that my journey on this earth is complete. Please don't be sad for too long. I have lived a happy life loving you both and have no regrets. Amber, my brave, strong girl, you have been my greatest comfort these past few years. I know how hard it was for you to see me sick, and I am eternally grateful for every minute you spent with me. But dear, your anger at your father only hurts you. I never blamed him for leaving. Sometimes the people we love most can't be there for us because of the strength of that love. Your father is a good man who punishes himself too much for things he couldn't control. Try to understand that, even if you can't forgive now. Matthew, my dear, stubborn, impossible husband. You were the love of my life, and nothing has changed that, not your pain, not your leaving, not your making sure I only felt sorry for you. I never pitied you, Matt. I admired you. I've seen you struggle. I've seen you try to deal with an unbearable burden. Yes, you made the wrong choice, pushing away everyone who loved you. But I understand why you did it. I didn't tell you about my illness out of revenge or resentment. I knew the news would break you completely. And perhaps it was my final act of selfishness. I wanted you to remember me healthy and full of life, not exhausted from chemotherapy. I leave you both with not only material things, but also the hope that you will find your way back to each other. That you, Matthew, will find your way back to yourself, to the person you were and still can be. With a love that doesn't die even with death, your Laurel." There was silence in the office. I stared at my hands, afraid to look up and meet Amber's or Howard's gaze. There was a lump in my throat that was impossible to swallow. "She always had a way with words," Howard finally said quietly, returning the letter to the envelope. I risked a glance up. Amber sat with her hands covering her face. Her shoulders were shaking, but she didn't make a sound. "Now, as for the distribution of the property," Howard continued in a more formal tone, "the house on Clover Street, including all furniture and personal effects, as well as a 2023-year-old Toyota Camry automobile, will become the full property of Amber Laurel Gaines." Amber nodded without taking her hands off her face. It was expected. I hadn't counted on any of the property. Laurel Gaines' personal savings in an account at the First National Bank of Ainsworth in the amount of $38,400 also passes to Amber Gaines, Howard continued. Again, no surprises. Laurel had always been thrifty, and even working as an elementary school teacher, she managed to save money. Next, Howard turned the page. The insurance payout on the Blue Life life insurance policy in the amount of $500,000. I flinched. $500,000? Laurel had insurance for that huge sum? Distributed as follows: $100,000 to Amber Gaines, $400,000 to Matthew Gaines. There was dead silence in the office. I stared at Howard, sure I'd misheard. Amber finally took her hands away from her face and stared at the lawyer with the same disbelief. "What?" Her voice was hoarse from crying. "No, this is some kind of mistake. Why would she—" Howard held up a hand. "It's not a mistake, Amber. Your mother took out a policy 5 months ago, right after she found out the final diagnosis. She was very specific in her instructions regarding the distribution of the payout." "But why?" Amber was looking at me now, and her eyes read not just bewilderment, but the real pain of betrayal. Howard coughed. "There's a clarification about that in the will. I quote, 'The funds given to Matthew Gaines are to be used by him to rebuild his life, including but not limited to purchasing a home, paying for medical and psychological services, returning to medical practice, or retraining for a new career. I trust that Matthew will use these funds wisely and find a path to healing.'" I couldn't believe my ears. Laurel had left me $400,000. Me, who abandoned her when she needed me the most. Me, who wasn't there for her when she was battling cancer. I can't accept that money, I said, before I had time to think. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Howard replied. Laurel's will is very clear. This money is intended for you for a specific purpose. You don't deserve it, Amber said quietly, looking at me. Why did she do this? Why did she leave you so much when you weren't even around? I shook my head, unable to find an answer. Laurel had always been generous, but this was something more than generous. This was an act of pure, unconditional love that I didn't deserve. There's one more thing, Howard said, pulling another envelope out of the folder. A personal letter from Matthew that Laurel asked me to give only to him. He held the envelope out to me. I took it with trembling hands, feeling a heaviness disproportionate to the weight of the paper. What's in it? Amber asked. I don't know, Howard answered. Laurel sealed it and said the contents were for Matthew's eyes only. Amber stood up abruptly. Fine. She's leaving him almost all the money and some other secret message. And I've been by her side every day. I watched her fade away. I held her hand when she couldn't breathe from the pain, and he didn't even know she was dying. I couldn't blame Amber for her anger. She was right. I didn't deserve any of this. Amber, Howard said softly, your mother loved you more than anything in the world. But she loved your father too, and she wanted that money to help him come back to life. Maybe it was her way of helping you both. Amber shook her head. I don't get it. I just don't get it. She turned to me. Are you happy? Did you get your last present from your mom? I didn't ask for it, Amber, I replied quietly. Of course you didn't ask for it. You never ask for anything. You just accept or push it away as it suits you. She grabbed her purse. I'm going to go now. I need some air. Howard stood up. Amber, please stay. We have a few more formalities to go over. What other formalities? She stopped at the door. It's clear. The house and some money to me, everything else to him. Daddy, who disappeared for 3 years and then showed up at the funeral like he had a right to. Amber, please, I tried, but she interrupted me. No, Daddy, I don't want to hear you apologize or explain. Mom can forgive you, but I can't. At least not now. With those words, she walked out, slamming the door. Howard and I sat in silence, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Give her time, Howard finally said. She's had a rough time. I nodded, clutching the envelope from Laurel in my hands. Howard, I don't understand. Why did she leave me so much money after everything I've done? The lawyer sighed. Laurel was very worried about you, Matt. Even when you separated, even when she found out about the diagnosis. She came here every week in the last few months to make sure all the details of the will were in order. But why didn't she tell me about the illness? She explained it in a letter. She was afraid the news would finally break you. Or maybe she just didn't want to see me. Didn't want me around, I said, voicing my biggest fear. Howard shook his head. No, Matt, she didn't. Laurel loved you to the very end. She talked about you every time she came here. She worried about how you were doing, whether you had enough to eat, whether you were warm in that trailer. I felt tears come to my throat. How did she know about the trailer? She was watching you, Matt. Not directly. She respected your desire to be alone, but she asked me to find out about you, where you live, what you do. I ran my hand over my face, trying to deal with my emotions. I don't deserve that money, Howard. I don't deserve her care. Not after I left her. Maybe, Howard shrugged. But that's not for you to decide. Laurel wanted you to get that money and use it to get your life back on track. Throwing them away or giving them up would be going against her last will. I looked at the envelope in my hands. What am I to do? Read the letter, Howard said simply, and then decide. He stood up, signaling that our formal meeting was over. The insurance company will contact you within a week. You'll need to provide bank details to transfer the funds. I nodded, still stunned by what was happening. "And Matt," Howard added when I was already at the door, "Laurel believed in you. Maybe it's time for you to believe in yourself, too." I walked out of the office, clutching the envelope like it was the only thing keeping me afloat. Outside, a fine rain was drizzling, the same rain that had fallen yesterday at the funeral. I walked without noticing where I was going, completely consumed with thoughts of Laurel, of her love I'd rejected, of her forgiveness I didn't deserve. I don't know how long I wandered the streets of Ainsworth. At some point I found myself in a small park near the center of town. Our park, as Laurel and I called it. This is where we used to walk when we first started dating. This is where I proposed to her under the old oak tree that still stood in place despite the years that had passed. I sat down on the bench under that oak tree and finally dared to open the envelope. Inside was a piece of paper written in Laurel's familiar, neat handwriting. "My dear Matt," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And maybe you're mad at me for not telling you about my illness, or for leaving you money you don't think you deserve. But let me explain. I never stopped loving you, even when you left, even when you didn't return my calls or answer the door. I knew you weren't doing it out of cruelty, but because you were punishing yourself for something you thought was unforgivable. Matt, I remember when Noah Pearson died. I knew you fought for his life for hours. I knew you refused to give up when everyone else knew there was no saving him. It wasn't your fault he died. It wasn't anybody's fault. Sometimes life is just cruel, and all we can do is accept that and move on. But you couldn't move on. You were stuck in that day, in that OR, with that boy. And somehow you convinced yourself that you didn't deserve happiness. You didn't deserve love. You didn't deserve life. I didn't tell you about my illness because I knew you'd blame yourself for that too. You'd think that if you'd been there, you would have noticed the symptoms sooner, would have saved me. But, Matt, even you can't save everyone. Some things just happen, and we have to accept them. The money I left you isn't a handout or a last-ditch attempt to control your life. It's my way of saying, I believe in you. I believe you can come back. Not to your old life. That life is gone. And that's okay, but to a new life where you can find purpose and maybe even happiness again. Buy a house, Matt, a real house, not that trailer you freeze in the winter. Go back to medicine if you feel you can, or find something else that brings you fulfillment. But please stop punishing yourself. One more thing, please find a way to make up with Amber. She's mad at you right now, and I get it, but she needs her dad, especially now that I won't be around. I have loved you every day of our lives together, Matt, and I will love you after I die, if that's even possible. Goodbye, my darling, and hello at the same time, because I hope this letter is not the end, but the beginning of something new for you. Always yours, Laurel. I reread the letter 3 times before the words began to blur in front of my eyes from crying. Laurel knew me better than I knew myself. She had anticipated my every reaction, my every thought, and she was right. If I knew about her illness, I would really blame myself. I would have thought I could have saved her if I had been there for her, if I had noticed the symptoms earlier. I would have turned her illness and death into another excuse to beat myself up. But now that everything had already happened, now that Laurel was gone, I could only face the truth. I wasn't there for her not because I didn't love her. God, I loved her so much it hurt physically. It was because I was too focused on my grief, on my guilt, on my punishment. I folded the letter and carefully returned it to the envelope. The sky over Ainsworth had finally cleared, and the rays of the afternoon sun were shining through the oak leaves, creating a bizarre pattern of light and shadow on the ground. Could I justify Laurel's faith in me? I didn't know the answer. The trailer greeted me cold and damp. After yesterday's rain, water dripped from the leaky roof into the corner, forming a small puddle on the floor. Before, I would have just put a bucket there and forgotten about it. But today, that leaky ceiling made me irritated. Maybe Laurel was right. Maybe it really is time for me to start living like a human being. I threw off my wet jacket and turned on the heater. It hummed harshly, giving off a meager warmth. It was at times like this that I felt most keenly how low I had fallen. From a top surgeon at a prestigious hospital to a man who was glad he at least had electricity. Laurel's letter was burning my pocket. I pulled it out and reread it again, pausing at each phrase as if trying to find something between the lines that I hadn't noticed before. I looked at my watch. It was almost 7 in the evening. Strangely, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the urge to reach for the bottle. Instead, I walked over to the small closet where I kept the few personal items I'd taken from home after breaking up with Laurel. On the very top shelf, behind a stack of old medical journals, was a brown cardboard box. I hadn't opened it since I'd left the hospital. I couldn't bring myself to look at what was inside. But today, after Laurel's words in the letter, I felt I had to do it. I carefully pulled the box out and set it on the small kitchen table. On the lid in faded marker was written, "Noah Pearson, simple and ruthless." When I opened the box, I smelled the musty stench of old paper. Inside were copies of the medical records I'd collected after the boy's death. The medical history, the results of all the tests and examinations, the records of the surgery, the pathologist's report, the report of the committee that investigated the case. I began to take out the papers one by one, spreading them out on the table. Here's a referral for surgery with a diagnosis of acute appendicitis. Standard procedure that I've done hundreds of times. Here are the pre-operative tests. Nothing unusual except for elevated leukocytosis, which is expected in inflammation. Here are the ultrasound results confirming the diagnosis. But then the weird part started. The surgical protocol, written in my hand, spoke of sudden complications. In the process of appendix removal, a sudden drop in blood pressure to 60/40 was noted. Resuscitative measures were carried out. Internal bleeding from a splenic artery aneurysm was detected. I remembered it like it was yesterday. We were just finishing surgery when the monitor showed a sudden drop in blood pressure. We couldn't figure out what was wrong until we discovered a growing hematoma in the area of the spleen. Splenic artery aneurysm is an extremely rare condition, especially in children. It ruptured right during surgery, and there was nothing we could do about it. The boy lost too much blood too fast. I continued going through the paperwork and stopped at the pathologist's report. Cause of death: massive internal bleeding due to ruptured splenic artery aneurysm. Additionally, multiple microaneurysms were found in the abdominal vessels, which may indicate an undiagnosed genetic disease. Genetic disease? I frowned, unable to remember that detail. With trembling hands, I thumbed through the remaining papers and found what I was looking for: an additional study that had been done well after the boy's death. Genetic testing of the tissue samples revealed a mutation in the gene responsible for synthesizing type 3 collagen. This mutation is characteristic of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome vascular type, a rare inherited connective tissue disease. In this disease, blood vessel walls are particularly fragile and prone to spontaneous rupture. Symptoms often do not appear until the first serious complication, which is usually the rupture of a major vessel. I reread that paragraph 3 times, trying to realize its significance. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome vascular type, a rare genetic disorder that is nearly impossible to diagnose before the first serious complication, especially in a child who looks perfectly healthy. I vaguely remembered the diagnosis from textbooks. It was one of those diseases we were told about in medical school but never expected to see in our practice. So rare that most doctors never encounter a single case in their entire careers. In the box was another folder, a thin folder labeled confidential. I opened it and discovered the results of genetic testing on Noah's parents. Both were found to carry the mutated gene, though neither had the disease. A classic case of autosomal recessive inheritance. Each parent had passed one copy of the defective gene to the boy, leading to the syndrome. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a wave of realization hit me. Noah didn't die because of my mistake. He died because of a rare genetic disease that was impossible to diagnose in advance. Even if we had known about it, it was unlikely we could have saved the boy when an aneurysm of that magnitude ruptured. But why didn't I remember that diagnosis? Why did I blame myself for years when the board had completely cleared me of all charges? And then I remembered. By the time the results of the genetic testing came back, I was in such a state that I was practically unable to absorb the information. I was convinced of my guilt and refused to hear anything that contradicted that conviction. And then I started drinking, and the alcohol completely clouded my memory. I sat over those papers for hours, rereading every document, every entry. There could be no doubt. Noah had died because of a genetic disease that no one could have foreseen. Not because of my mistake, not because of my incompetence, not because of my arrogance. So why did I let this case ruin my life? Why did I refuse to accept the truth, preferring it to the convenient lie of my own guilt? Maybe it was easier to believe I could make a difference than to accept the randomness, the ruthlessness of fate taking the lives of children for no reason. It was starting to get light outside the window. I hadn't even noticed how I'd sat up all night working on documents. Tiredness came suddenly, but with it came a strange relief. It was as if the heavy weight I'd been carrying on my shoulders for 8 years was suddenly a little lighter. But I needed reassurance. I needed someone to confirm that I was understanding these documents correctly, that I wasn't grasping at straws in a desperate attempt to justify myself. I knew only one person I could trust in this matter: Sonia Ramirez, chief of surgery at St. Elizabeth's, the same one who fired me 3 years ago. She was in the OR that day, assisting me. She saw everything with her own eyes. I picked up my phone and found her number one of the few I'd kept since leaving the hospital. It was too early to call, but I knew Sonia was always at the hospital by 7 in the morning. If I hurried, I could intercept her before the workday started. I dressed quickly, put my most important documents in a folder, and walked out of the trailer. The morning air was fresh after yesterday's rain. Birds were singing somewhere, and the sky was beginning to turn pink in the east. Nature itself seemed to be hinting at a new beginning. It was about 3 kilometers to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. I had once traveled there in an expensive car. Now I walked. But strangely, the walk didn't depress me as it usually did. I walked at a brisk pace, feeling a surge of energy I hadn't felt in a long time. The hospital greeted me with the familiar smell of antiseptic and sterility. I immediately felt out of place in my shabby clothes among the white coats and uniforms. But I didn't care. I hadn't come here to make an impression. Sonia's office was on the 3rd floor at the end of a long corridor. The sign on the door still read, "Dr. Sonia Ramirez, Chief of Surgery." I took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," came a familiar voice. I opened the door and saw Sonia behind the desk. She looked almost exactly the same as she had 3 years ago. The same short graying hair, the same shrewd brown eyes, the same thin glasses on the tip of her nose. Only a few new wrinkles had appeared around his eyes. Sonia looked up from her papers and froze when she saw me. Her face reflected a whole gamut of emotions: surprise, concern, wariness. "Matthew?" She said my name with a questioning tone, as if she wasn't sure if it was really me. "Hello, Sonia." I closed the door behind me and stood at the entrance, hesitant to come closer. She stared at me silently for a few seconds, noting every detail of my appearance: my overgrown beard, my ragged clothes, my tired face. Then her gaze softened. "Sit down." She pointed to a chair across from her desk. I walked over and sat down, clutching the file folder tightly. I didn't know where to begin, how to explain my sudden appearance after 3 years of silence. "I heard about Laurel," Sonia said quietly. "I'm sorry, Matt." I nodded, feeling a lump come up to my throat. Of course she knew. Ainsworth is a small town where everyone knows everything about each other. Thank you, I squeezed out. There was an awkward pause. I stared at my hands, not knowing how to get to what I'd come to do. What can I do for you? Sonia finally asked, breaking the silence. I looked up and met her eyes. There was no judgment in them, only tired understanding. I wanted to ask about Noah Pearson, I finally said. Sonia tensed slightly, but nodded, waiting for me to continue. I reread his medical history yesterday, I continued, opening the folder, and I found something I didn't remember, or didn't want to remember. I pulled out the pathologist's report and the results of the genetic testing and put it in front of her. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome vascular type, I pronounced. A rare genetic disorder. The aneurysm that killed him. It was inevitable, right? It would have ruptured sooner or later, and no one could have foreseen it. Sonia scrutinized the documents, though I was sure she remembered the contents. Then she took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, a gesture I knew so well. It was the way she always did when she was about to say something difficult. Yes, Matt, it's true. Noah died because of a genetic disease that was undiagnosed before the first serious symptoms appeared. In his case, before the aneurysm ruptured. The commission completely dropped all charges against you for that very reason. Then why don't I remember it? Why did I keep blaming myself all these years? Sonia sighed. Because you didn't want to remember it, Matt. By the time the genetic test results came back, you'd already convinced yourself you were guilty. You refused to listen. And then the spiral of self-destruction began. Alcohol, depression. We all tried to get through to you, but you wouldn't listen to anyone. She was right. I remembered how Sonia had come to me, how she had tried to talk to me, to show me the documents, to explain what had happened. But I was deaf to her words, too immersed in my grief and guilt. Why, Sonia? I asked quietly. Why have I done this to myself? She looked at me for a long time, as if weighing whether to say what she thought. At last she made up her mind. Because it was easier for you to blame yourself than to accept that sometimes we're powerless, Matt. You've always been a perfectionist, always thought you could control everything. Noah's death shattered that illusion, and you couldn't handle it. Her words hit me like a slap in the face, but there was truth in them. Bitter, unpleasant, but the truth. What about Noah's parents? I asked. Do they know about the diagnosis? Sonia nodded. Yes. They were told the results of the genetic testing. They were devastated, but it gave them some kind of explanation for what happened. And they never blamed you, Matt. No one did. No one but myself. So now what? I didn't know who I was asking, Sonia or myself. She smiled slightly, the first smile she'd given me since I'd arrived. That's up to you, Matt. What do you want to do now that you know the truth? Good question. What did I want to do? For 8 years I'd lived with the conviction that my hands, meant to heal, had brought death. Now that that certainty was shaken, I felt lost. I don't know, I answered honestly. Sonia nodded as if she had expected that answer. That's normal. You need time to rethink things. I knew what she was talking about. I now knew the truth about Noah, which could free me from the burden of guilt I'd carried for so long. I have to go, I said, standing up. Thank you for listening. Sonia stood up as well. You're welcome, Matt. Come by again. Not as a patient, but just to talk. I nodded, not trusting my voice, gathered my papers and headed for the door. Matt, Sonia called out to me when I had already grabbed the handle. You were a great surgeon, one of the best I've ever worked with. That hasn't changed. I didn't turn around, just nodded, feeling tears come to my eyes. I quickly walked out into the hallway and closed the door behind me. On the way out of the hospital, I didn't remember where I was going. My feet carried me through the familiar streets of Ainsworth. Sonia's words were spinning in my head, interspersed with words from Laurel's letter. It wasn't your fault he died. It wasn't anyone's fault. You've always been a perfectionist, Always thought you could control everything. You were stuck that day in that operating room with that boy. Somehow I ended up on the bank of the river that runs through Ainsworth. This is where Laurel and I often walked when we were young. This is where I had proposed to her 22 years ago. I sat on a bench and stared at the running water, trying to collect my thoughts. The truth about Noah was freeing me, but it also forced me to face another, more painful truth. I had ruined my own life. Not an accident, not fate, not the genetic disease of a child unknown to me. It was me. I rejected the help and love of those who cared for me. I pushed Laurel away when she needed me most. I wasn't there for her when she was battling cancer. I robbed Amber of her father at the most important stage of her life. And all because of what? The illusion of control that I couldn't let go? Because of an inability to accept that sometimes we really are powerless in the face of illness and death? The river flowed before me, calm and inexorable. I remembered the words I often said to my medical students. Our job is not to defeat death, but to delay it as much as possible and reduce suffering along the way. When did I lose that wisdom? When did I allow pride to cloud my mind? I didn't know the answers to these questions, but for the first time in a long time I felt the desire to find them. For the first time in 8 years I felt something akin to hope. I had a long journey ahead of me, rebuilding a relationship with Amber, if that was even possible, to find a new purpose in life, to learn to live without Laurel, but with the memory of her love and forgiveness. But today, I took the first step. I learned the truth about Noah Pearson and began to accept the truth about myself. That was the beginning. For 4 days I'd been gathering the courage to call Amber. 4 days after talking to Sonia, I wandered around Ainsworth like a ghost, trying to make sense of everything I'd learned about Noah and myself. The town seemed different, like I was seeing it for the first time after a long sleep. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. I watched the people at Donna's Cafe, where I'd stopped for coffee. They were living their normal lives, laughing, talking, rushing about their business. And it was like I was looking at them through a glass, cut off from that normalcy by years of self-isolation. Could I ever go back? Or is it too late? In the trailer, I found an old cell phone, charged it up and found it still worked. Amber's number was in my contacts. I'd never deleted it, even though I hadn't called my daughter in over 2 years. It was about 6 o'clock Tuesday night when I finally worked up the courage to press the call button. My heart was pounding like a teenager's before a first date. 3 beeps, 4, 5. I was about to hang up, figuring she wouldn't answer when her voice came through the receiver. Hello? There was wariness and surprise in that single word. Amber, it's me. I didn't know what else to say. There was a long pause. I could almost see her clutching the phone, deciding whether or not to continue the conversation. What do you need? She finally asked. Not rudely, but discreetly. To talk. Can we meet? Again the pause. Why? Good question. Why? What could I tell her? That I realized I'd been wrong all these years? That I wanted to turn back the clock? That I regret everything? Because you're my daughter, I said simply, and because I owe you an explanation. I heard her quiet sigh. An explanation, she repeated bitterly. 8 years later. Better late than never? I tried with a clumsy smile that she couldn't see, of course. I'm not sure, her voice sounded tired. I understood her. Too many years had passed, too much pain. I was about to back out when she suddenly said, Okay, tomorrow at 7, at the Fisherman's Shelter. The Fisherman's Shelter was a little cafe on the riverbank where Laurel and I used to frequent when Amber was little. They served the best fried trout in the neighborhood. Thank you, I exhaled in relief. Don't thank me, she replied. I'm doing this for Mom. She hung up before I could respond. I sat looking at the phone for a long time. Tomorrow I would see my daughter for the first time in 2 years, and I'll have a chance to explain everything. if I could find the right words. I spent the rest of the day trying to clean myself up. I trimmed my beard, which had become an unkempt mess over the years. I washed the best shirt I had left from my old life. I found old pants in the closet that had once fit me, but now hung around my slim body. I looked at myself in the cracked mirror above the sink. Even after all my efforts, I looked like a homeless man trying to appear like a decent human being. Wrinkles that hadn't been there 8 years ago furrowed my face. Gray in my hair and beard. Eyes that have lost their luster. 45 years old and I looked 60. But it was the best I could do. At least Amber would see that I was trying. The next day dragged agonizingly slow. I couldn't read or watch the old TV or even sleep. I was tormented by thoughts of the upcoming meeting. What would I say? How would I explain 8 years of self-destruction? How would I apologize for abandoning her and Laurel when I needed her most? By 6 p.m., I couldn't sit still. I decided to walk, even though it was at least 2 kilometers to the fisherman's shelter. I needed time to gather my thoughts. Ainsworth is a small town. Every street, every turn held memories. There's the park where Amber learned to ride her bike. This is the school where I took her to first grade. There's Fitzgerald's Bakery, where we bought blueberry muffins on Sundays. The ghosts of the past surrounded me, whispering in my ear stories of happy times I had destroyed with my own hands. I arrived at the fisherman's shelter 20 minutes early. The cafe hadn't changed much. The same wooden tables, the same pictures of fishermen with their catch on the walls, the same smell of fried fish and spices. I sat looking at the river slowly flowing past the cafe. The sun was beginning to set, coloring the water with golden tones. It was beautiful. When was the last time I'd noticed things like this? At exactly 7, the door to the cafe opened and Amber walked in. She looked just like Laurel at her age. The same brown hair, the same expressive eyes, the same determined chin. Only there was a wariness in her eyes that Laurel never had. She saw me and froze for a moment. Then she took a deep breath and headed toward the table. I stood up, not knowing how to greet my own daughter. Should I give her a hug? Shake hands? I ended up just nodding, feeling ridiculous. "Thanks for coming," I said as she sat down across from me. "I promised," she replied simply. "You look good," I finally said, breaking the silence. Amber looked at me skeptically. "You don't?" I grinned involuntarily. "Yeah, I do, but I'm working on it." "Really?" There was doubt in her voice. "Really," I nodded. "The last few days have been a revelation." She waited for me to continue, not helping me. I understood. I was the one who should have been talking, explaining, apologizing. She didn't. "I reread Noah Pearson's medical history," I began. "The boy who died on my operating table 8 years ago." Amber tilted her head slightly. "I know who Noah Pearson is, Dad. Mom told me." "Of course," I rubbed my neck nervously. "He had a rare genetic disorder, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome of the vascular type. It makes the walls of blood vessels very fragile. During surgery, his splenic artery aneurysm ruptured. It's something no one could have foreseen. No one could have prevented it. And you're just now realizing that?" Amber looked at me incredulously. "No," I shook my head. "I'd been told that before. Sonia Ramirez, your mom, the commission that investigated the case. But I didn't want to listen. It was easier for me to believe I was at fault than to accept that sometimes we're powerless." "Why?" she asked. I sighed. "I don't know. Maybe pride. Maybe fear. If I couldn't save Noah, then I'm not as good as I thought I was. Then there are things I can't control. And that scared me." Amber stirred her tea slowly. "And that's why you ruined your life? Our life?" Her words hit me like a slap in the face, but there was a truth in them that I couldn't escape. "Yes," I admitted, "and there is no forgiveness for me." "Mom forgave you," Amber said quietly. "I know. She was better than I deserved." Amber sipped her tea, scrutinizing me over her cup. You know, she never stopped believing in you, even when you stopped returning her calls, even when we found out about the cancer. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Tell me about her, about the last year. Amber was quiet for a moment as if deciding if she should. Then she began to speak, quietly and evenly. It started with back pain. She thought she'd just pulled a muscle helping carry books in the school library, but the pain wouldn't go away. Then she started losing weight rapidly. At first, the doctors thought it was her stomach, but then jaundice appeared, and they did an MRI. She paused, remembering that day. I was with her when she got the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, already metastasized to her liver. The doctor said she had 3 to 6 months to live. I closed my eyes, visualizing the scene. Laurel, receiving the death sentence, and Amber, at 23, forced to be by her dying mother's side, alone, without me. She didn't cry, Amber continued, at least not in front of me. She said, "Well, then, I guess we'll just have to make good use of this time." And she did. She made a list of everything she wanted to do. She went to the Grand Canyon, learned to play the ukulele, recorded video messages for all her students. I felt tears coming to my eyes, but I held them back. This was Amber's story, her pain. I had no right to override it with my emotions. She went through 1 round of chemotherapy, but it only got worse. Then she decided against further treatment, said she'd rather spend the rest of her time with a clear head than in nausea and weakness. I nodded. That sounded like Laurel, the pragmatic, courageous woman I'd fallen in love with 22 years ago. She's been in a lot of pain these past weeks. Amber's voice shook. The painkillers were barely helping. But she still smiled when I came over, asked about my work, about my friends, like it was just a regular visit, not a goodbye. Tears were running down her cheeks now, and she didn't try to hide them. You know what she said to me the day before she died? Amber looked me straight in the eye. She said, "Don't be mad at your father, Amber. He's punishing himself more than any of us could ever punish him, and someday he'll realize he's worthy of forgiveness." Now I was crying too, unashamed of my tears. Did she really say that? Amber nodded. Yes. And you know what the worst part is? I couldn't promise her that. I was too mad at you for not having you around, for the fact that I had to be strong on my own. "I'm so sorry, Amber," I said, barely holding back a sob. "If I could go back and change everything." "But you can't." Her voice sounded firm despite the tears. "No one can. Mom's gone, and I still don't know if I can forgive you." I nodded, understanding. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Amber. I just want you to know that I realize what I've done, and I want to try to be a better person, for Laurel's sake, for you, for me." She looked at me carefully, as if assessing the sincerity of my words. "What are you going to do with the money your mom left you?" This question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about it specifically yet. Don't know. Probably go back into medicine, not as a surgeon. My hands aren't the same anymore, but maybe as a counselor or a teacher, or find another way to help people. "That's what she'd want," Amber nodded. "She always said you were born to be a doctor." We sat in silence, each immersed in our own thoughts. It was finally dark outside the window, and the river was a black ribbon glistening in the light of the street lamps. "I'd like to visit her grave," I said at last. Could you come with me?" Amber stared at me for a long moment, and I was about to think she was going to say no. But then she nodded slowly. "Okay, this Saturday. I'll pick you up at 10. "Thanks." I didn't know what else to say. She finished her tea and set the cup down. "I have to go now. I have an early meeting tomorrow." I nodded, not wanting to push. This conversation was already more than I could have hoped for. Can I call you? Just to see how you're doing," I asked, when she was already getting up. Amber hesitated, then nodded. You can, but don't expect too much, Dad. We have a long way to go. I know, I said, and it was the truth. She left and I stayed sitting, looking at the river. Our conversation was hard, but at the same time, it was liberating. For the first time in a long time, I felt connected to my daughter, albeit fragile as the first ice on the river. The next few days passed in a strange state of anticipation. I called the insurance company and gave the details of my old, long unused account to transfer the money Laurel had left behind. The company representative was emphatically polite, but I sensed surprise behind the politeness. He was probably wondering how a homeless ragamuffin could have gotten that amount of money. I also began looking for information about opportunities to return to medicine. My path as a surgeon was over. Too long a break, too much alcohol wreaking havoc on my nervous system. But there were other avenues: counseling, teaching, working in hospices, where compassion is more important than precision of hand. On Friday, I received a message from the bank that $400,000 had been deposited into my account. When I saw that amount on the ATM screen, I felt dizzy. So much money, all thanks to Laurel, her final act of love and faith in me. At 10 sharp on Saturday, a blue Toyota pulled up in front of my trailer. Amber honked without getting out of the car. I got out holding a bouquet of white lilies, Laurel's favorite flowers that I'd bought with some of the money I'd just received. Amber didn't say anything when I got in the car, just nodded when she noticed the flowers. We drove in silence. The cemetery was on the outskirts of Ainsworth, on a small hill overlooking the town. The day was clear and quiet, not a breeze in sight. The sky was the deep blue color that only comes in autumn. Amber walked ahead, confidently heading toward the right place. She must have been here often. Laurel's grave looked simple and elegant like herself. A gray granite stone with her name, dates of life, and a short inscription: loving mother, teacher, friend. Her light will never go out. I stood looking at those words and felt my heart clench. Laurel had always been a light, to her students, to Amber, to me, even in her darkest moments. I placed the lilies on the grave and knelt down. I don't know how much time passed as I sat there, silently talking to Laurel in my thoughts, telling her everything I realized, promising not to waste the chance she'd given me. Amber stood beside me, quiet and thoughtful. When I finally stood up, she said, I brought her peonies every week. She loved them almost as much as the lilies. I know, I replied. Laurel always said peonies reminded her of her childhood at her grandmother's house. We stood side by side, two people bound by love for a woman who was no longer with us. I've decided I'm going to use the money to get back into medicine, I said finally. But not as a surgeon. Amber turned to me. How? I want to work in hospice. The words escaped my lips on their own, even though I'd never thought about it specifically before. Helping people who are dying, making their last days easier, being there for them and their families. Amber looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Mom would approve. You think so? I'm sure. There was something resembling respect in her voice now. This is the right way for you, Dad. Daddy. She called me Dad without bitterness in her voice. A small victory, but so meaningful. Thank you, I said quietly. We stood at the grave for a little longer, then walked slowly back to the car. Amber was silent, but it was no longer a hostile silence, but a calm, almost cozy silence. I'm thinking of selling the house, she said abruptly as we approached the car. It's too big for me alone, and it has too many memories. I nodded, understanding. The house Laurel and I had bought when Amber was 5 was filled with our family's history, a happy story that ended so tragically. What do you think of it? She asked, looking at me askance. I was touched that she was asking my opinion. I think you should do what makes you happy, Amber. Laurel would want you to? She nodded as if I confirmed her own thoughts. Yeah, I guess you're right. We got into the car and Amber started the engine, but instead of driving straight off, she turned to me. You know, I can't promise things will be like they used to be, Dad. Too much water has passed, but I can try. For Mom's sake. I felt tears come to my throat. That's all I can ask, Amber. She nodded and drove out of the cemetery parking lot. We were heading back to town, me to my trailer, her to her life. But something had changed between us. A small crack in the wall I'd built myself, the first step toward healing. As we pulled up to the trailer, I turned to my daughter. I'm going to find an apartment in town. Something modest, but decent. And once I'm settled in, maybe you could come over for dinner sometime? Amber thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe. Call me when you're settled in. It wasn't a promise, but it was a chance. And I couldn't ask for more than that. I got out of the car and waved goodbye. Amber nodded and drove off, leaving me standing in front of the trailer that would soon no longer be my home. Inside, I sat down at the table and pulled the tattered envelope with Laurel's letter out of my pocket. Reread it again, every word, every phrase. Buy a house, Matt. A real house, not this trailer you freeze in during the winter. Go back to medicine if you feel you can, or find something else that brings you fulfillment. I knew what I would do with the money she left me. Find a modest but decent place to live in Ainsworth. Take a course in palliative care. I will try to get a job in a hospice, if not as a doctor, at least as an orderly or an assistant. I'll be there for those who are dying and their families, helping them get through it with dignity and minimal pain. It won't bring Laurel back. It won't atone for my guilt to her and Amber. It won't undo 8 years of self-destruction. But it will be a start. A new path where I can use my knowledge and experience to help others. A path where perhaps I can find forgiveness, not just from others, but from myself. I folded the letter and carefully returned it to the envelope. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time in 8 years, I had a purpose. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could do something worthwhile with my life. I opened the trailer window, letting in the fresh night air. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the urge to drink. Instead, another, almost forgotten feeling was stirring inside me. Hope. I had a lot to do. Find a new place to live. Find out about palliative care courses. Contact hospices in Ainsworth and the surrounding area. Start a new life. At 45, after 8 years of self-destruction. It won't be easy. But for Laurel's sake, for Amber's sake, for my own sake, I was willing to try. It had been a week since my conversation with Amber at the cemetery. I'd gotten a lot done in that time. First, I rented a small studio apartment on the outskirts of Ainsworth, nothing fancy, but with hot water, heat, and no leaky roof. Compared to the trailer, it was a palace. Then I went to the barber shop where I not only cut my overgrown hair and beard but also got my hands cleaned up. A manicure was not a luxury for a former surgeon but a necessity, even if I never picked up a scalpel again. I bought new clothes, not expensive, but decent. For the first time in 3 years, I saw in the mirror not a homeless ragamuffin, but a normal, middle-aged man, tired, with gray in his hair and wrinkles that weren't there 8 years ago, but still a man, not a ghost. I found out about a palliative care course in a neighboring town, an hour's bus ride away. I signed up for the nearest course, which started in a month. This gave me time to prepare and, most importantly, to find a job. The money left by Laurel was a substantial amount, but I didn't want to spend it on everyday necessities. It was to go towards my retraining, a fresh start. Today was Monday morning, the day I decided to return to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, not as a patient and not as a visitor. I was going to ask for a job, any job, even the simplest one. I needed to feel a part of the medical world again, even if only on the lowest rung. I put on a fresh blue shirt, dark pants, and a jacket I'd bought at a thrift store. I looked at myself in the mirror and nervously adjusted my collar. It was strange to see myself in decent clothes again. It was like I was trying on someone else's life. On the way to the hospital, I stopped by a flower store and bought a small bouquet. Not for anyone in particular, but just because I wanted to enter the hospital not empty-handed. It seemed like the right thing to do, a small gesture of reconciliation with a place that had once been the center of my life. The hospital greeted me with its usual bustle. People rushed through the corridors, nurses pushed medicine carts, and somewhere in the distance I could hear a baby crying. The smell of antiseptic hit my nostrils, so familiar that my heart clenched with nostalgia. I headed straight for human resources. The woman behind the desk, whom I didn't know, looked up at me with tired eyes. "What can I do for you?" she asked mechanically. "I'd like to inquire about employment opportunities," I said, trying to make my voice sound confident. She looked me over from head to toe, lingering her gaze on the flowers. "What's your major?" I took a deep breath. "I'm a surgeon. Used to be a surgeon, to be exact. Worked here for 15 years, until 2022. Her eyes widened with surprise. "You're Dr. Gaines?" I nodded, not knowing if that was a good sign or a bad one. What had been said about me since I'd left? What was my reputation now? "I've heard about you," she said, and her tone softened. "You were one of the best." They had been. The passing of time no longer cut my ears like it used to. I accepted it as fact. "Yes, I was, but I'm not looking for a job as a surgeon right now. I'd like to," I stammered, choosing my words. "I'd like to start at the beginning, from the easiest position possible." She frowned. "You mean an administrative position?" "No," I shook my head. "I mean an orderly position." Now she was looking at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I was. "Dr. Gaines, do you understand that an orderly is—" "I know what an orderly is," I interrupted gently. "A person who cleans rooms, moves patients, helps with basic care. That's exactly what I need." She shook her head, clearly puzzled. "I need to discuss this with management. Cases like this aren't exactly common." "I understand," I nodded. "But can I talk to Dr. Ramirez? She knows me." The woman thought for a moment, then nodded. "Wait here." She walked out, leaving me alone in the small office. I sat looking at the wall where photos of medical school graduates hung. In one of them was me, young, with dark hair, a confident smile, and a future that seemed cloudless. I didn't know then that my confidence would become my curse. 15 minutes later, the door opened and Sonia Ramirez walked in. She looked exactly the same as she had the week before when I'd come to her with Noah's paperwork, only today she was wearing a white robe instead of her usual clothes. "Matthew," she said my name without surprise but with a slight strain. "Linda tells me you're looking for a job as an orderly." "Yes," I replied simply. Sonia closed the door and sat down across from me. "Why?" she asked bluntly. I thought for a moment before answering. I needed to explain it properly, not just to her, but to myself. Because I want to go back into medicine, but I can't be a surgeon, and not just because of the break in practice. I don't believe I'm eligible anymore. "Matt, no, let me finish." I held up my hand. "I was a good surgeon, yes, but I was overconfident. I thought I could control everything, that I could save everyone, and when I couldn't save Noah, I collapsed. Instead of accepting my limitations, I decided I was a terrible doctor and person." Sonia listened silently, not interrupting. I realize now that the truth is in the middle. I wasn't a terrible doctor, but I wasn't a god who can control life and death either. I'm just a human being, with all the human limitations. I paused, gathering my thoughts. I want to start at the beginning, from the most basic job in medicine, to remember what it means to just take care of patients without all that hubris. Sonia stared at me for a long time, as if trying to see into my soul. Finally, she nodded. I respect your decision, Matt, but you have to realize it's not going to be easy. People are going to talk, some with pity, others with schadenfreude. Are you ready for that? Yes, I answered firmly. I'm not running away from my past anymore. She sighed. Good. We have an opening for an orderly in the oncology ward. The job is hard both emotionally and physically. Would it be a good fit? Perfect, I nodded. Come by tomorrow morning by 8 o'clock. Bring your paperwork for processing. And Matt, she hesitated. Yeah? I'm glad you're back. Those simple words meant more to me than she could have imagined. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital 20 minutes before my appointment time. The Human Resources Department was already waiting for me. The paperwork took about an hour. As I signed the employment contract, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if the part of me that had been lost had finally returned. After processing, I was escorted to the oncology ward and introduced to the head nurse, an energetic woman in her 50s named Martha Collins. "So you're the same Dr. Gaines," she said, studying me closely. "I used to be," I replied. She nodded as if my answer clarified something for her. "Come on, I'll show you to the locker room and give you a uniform." The junior staff locker room was in the basement, a small room with metal lockers and benches. Martha handed me a light blue orderly's uniform and a locker key. "Get changed and go up to the ward. Scott will show you what to do." She left, leaving me alone in the empty locker room. I opened my locker, empty, with a lone hanger inside. My new home in the hospital. I slowly took off my clothes and put on my uniform. It was a little big, but overall it fit okay. I looked at myself in the small mirror on the locker door. The light blue corpsman's uniform made me almost unrecognizable. This was no longer Dr. Gaines, a respected surgeon, or the homeless alcoholic I'd been for the past 3 years. This was someone new, someone who was just starting out. I took a deep breath and closed my locker. It was time to go up to the ward and meet Scott, my new mentor. Scott turned out to be a sturdy man in his 30s with kind eyes and tattoos on his arms. He met me at the nursing station, and to my relief, showed no surprise at the sight of a former surgeon in an orderly's uniform. "You're the new guy, right, Matt?" He held out his hand. "Yeah," I shook his hand. "Thanks for showing me what to do." "No problem," he smiled. "It's pretty simple around here. Come on, I'll give you a tour." Scott spent the next 2 hours showing me around the department, explaining where everything was, familiarizing me with the daily routine and my duties. The job really wasn't difficult, but it required physical stamina and emotional fortitude. Basically, you'll be helping the nurses with patients, turning those who can't move on their own, helping with hygiene procedures, escorting them to checkups, Scott explained. Plus, cleaning rooms, changing linens, sometimes helping out at the post. Nothing fancy, but it's important work. "I understand," I nodded. "The hardest part is the emotional part," he continued more quietly. "This is oncology. Some patients recover and go home, others don't. You have to know how to deal with it." I nodded, thinking of Laurel. She'd spent her last days in just such a ward. Someone like Scott had helped her when I couldn't. "I can handle it," I said, and it wasn't an empty promise. By the end of the day, I was exhausted physically, but emotionally I felt better than I had in years. There was something soothing about the simple acts of changing bed linens, helping a patient to the bathroom, wiping down surfaces with disinfectant solution. A job without life-changing decisions, without the fear of making a mistake and killing someone, without the weight of responsibility that once crushed me. As I was changing back into my clothes at the end of my shift, Sonia Ramirez walked into the locker room. "How was your first day?" she asked, leaning against the lockers. "Good," I answered honestly. "Tired, but it's the right kind of tired." She nodded, understanding. "Matt, I want you to know that if you need to talk about anything, My door is always open. Thank you, Sonia. She paused as if she wanted to say something else, but changed her mind. She just nodded and walked out, leaving me to finish changing. When I left the hospital that night, I felt light at heart, despite the physical fatigue. I knew it was just the beginning of a long journey, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. At home, I found a message from Amber on my answering machine. "Hey, Dad, just wanted to see how you were doing. Call me when you can." A short message, but it meant the world to me. I called her and told her about my first day in my new role. She listened without judgment and at the end of the conversation wished me luck, a small step towards repairing our relationship. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. I was getting used to a new job, a new role, a new life. Alongside my job, I started taking a palliative care course in a neighboring town. Twice a week, after my shift, I would get on the bus and go to the classes, soaking up new knowledge that helped me better understand the patients in the oncology department. Many people in the hospital knew who I used to be. Some doctors looked at me with bewilderment or pity. Others avoided me altogether. But there were some who respected me for my decision to return, albeit in a different role. The nurses and other orderlies accepted me as an equal. I wasn't trying to stand out or remind them of my past. I just did my job as well as I could. 3 months after I returned to the hospital, an incident occurred that changed the way many people viewed me. A patient in the oncology ward, a man about my age with lung cancer, suddenly collapsed during a procedure. I was nearby, helping the nurse. My instincts kicked in before I could think. I checked his breathing, his pulse, his pupils. "Anaphylaxis," I told the nurse. "We need adrenaline, stat." She hesitated for a second, looking at me, the orderly who had suddenly started giving medical orders. But something in my voice or look convinced her. She rushed to the medicine cabinet while I began resuscitative measures. By the time the doctor on duty arrived, the nurse and I had already stabilized the patient. It later turned out that he had a severe allergic reaction to a new chemotherapy drug. After that incident, something changed. Nurses started asking for my opinion on medical issues. Some doctors started saying hello to me in the hallways. Sonia Ramirez invited me to the morning ward conference, not as an orderly, but as a counselor. "You're still a doctor, Matt," she told me. "Even if you're not practicing as a surgeon, your knowledge and experience can save lives. Don't give up that part of yourself." And I didn't give it up. I continued to work as an orderly, but I also began sharing my medical knowledge when appropriate. Not imposing my opinion, not trying to lead, just helping where I could. 6 months after my first day at the hospital, 2 other important events occurred. Firstly, I completed a course in palliative care and became certified. Second, St. Elizabeth's Hospital opened a new unit, a hospice for terminally ill patients. Sonia Ramirez called me into her office the day the opening was announced. "Matt," she said without preamble, "I want you to work at the new hospice." I frowned. "As an orderly?" "No," she shook her head. "As a palliative care consultant. You've done the courses, you've got the medical training and experience, but most importantly, you have an understanding and compassion that you can't get from textbooks." I was stunned. "Are you sure? After everything that's happened?" "Matt," she interrupted, "for the past 6 months you've proven every day that you're worthy of a second chance. You've worked as an orderly without complaining or reminding anyone of your past status. You've been learning, growing, helping where you can. You became part of this hospital again, not as a surgeon, but as someone who really cares about the patients." I didn't know what to say. "The hospice opens in a month," Sonia continued. "Think about it. It won't be easy. Working with the dying is never easy. But I think you're exactly what we need." I thought about that sentence all the way home. Working in hospice was exactly what I had dreamed of when I decided to use Laurel's money to get back into medicine. The opportunity to help people in their last days, to make their passing as dignified and comfortable as possible. There was another surprise waiting for me at home. Amber had come to visit. We had seen each other a few times over the past few months, usually at a coffee shop or restaurant. Our relationship was slowly but surely recovering, but this was the first time she'd come to my house. "I've decided to sell the house," she said without preamble as we sat down at the table with cups of tea. "I've found buyers. They're moving in next month." "How do you feel about that?" I asked, knowing how many memories were associated with this house. "Weird," she shrugged, "but the right thing to do. Time to move on." I nodded, understanding. We all moved on, each in our own way. "Sonia Ramirez offered me a job at the new hospice," I said, "not as an orderly, but as a palliative care consultant." Amber looked at me in surprise, then smiled slowly. "Mom would love that." "You think so?" "I'm sure she would. She always believed you'd go back to medicine, said it was your calling." We sat in silence, thinking about Laurel. She was no longer with us, but her love, her faith, her forgiveness had brought us here, to a slow, painful, but still healing. I accepted Sonia's offer the next day. After another month, the hospice opened its doors and I began working there, not as a surgeon saving lives, but as a doctor helping people to leave with dignity. My job was no longer to fight death, but to make patients' last days as comfortable as possible. I used my medical knowledge to control pain and other symptoms, used my experience as a caregiver to provide physical comfort, and used my personal experience of loss and grief to support not only the patients, but their families as well. It was hard work, emotionally exhausting, often sad, but it also had a satisfaction that I hadn't experienced even in my best days of surgical practice. I was no longer a god in a white coat deciding who would live and who would die. I was just a person who helped others in their most difficult moments. Amber started visiting me more often. Sometimes we talked about Laurel, reminiscing about happy times, sometimes about my hospice work, sometimes just about everyday things. Our relationship would never be the same as it had been before I left. Too much water had passed. But we were building something new, and that was important. On my 46th birthday, I went to the cemetery to Laurel's grave. I brought her white lilies and sat next to her for a long time, talking about my new life, my hospice work, the times Amber and I had met. I knew she couldn't hear me, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I could finally talk to her without guilt or self-deprecation. "Thank you," I said before I left, "for believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself, for forgiving me even when I couldn't forgive myself, for giving me a chance to start over." The wind rustled the leaves of the trees as if answering me. I got up and went home to my new life, which wasn't perfect, not the life I'd once dreamed of, but still a life worth living.